All right, this is Chapter 15, Holes Anatomy, Part 1. Oh, wait a sec. I got a call. Hi, hon. Yeah, I'm recording a lecture right now. I can't talk. What? You're wearing what? Oh, yeah, it is cold outside. Yeah, I understand why you're wearing a fleece. Okay, I'll call you back. Bye. All right, let's start. Sorry about the interruption. We're talking about the heart and blood vessels. So it's a closed system. A heart pumps the blood all the way around and circulates it throughout. There's 5 quarts of blood pumping it all around. And the function is to deliver nutrients, mainly oxygen, and remove carbon dioxide and other waste products. So the heart itself is in the thorax as we describe it, and it's between the lungs. Its apex is pointed toward the left hip. So the heart kind of sits like this in your chest. The base points towards the right shoulder. And it's about the size of your fist. The bigger your fist, the bigger your heart. Not really. And you can see it here. Okay, resting here on the diaphragm. Here's all the various tubes and so on that we'll talk about, the blood vessels and the lungs on either side. So the heart itself has a covering. The heart is actually sitting in a bag. You'll see, we'll show you some stuff later. But this bag is called the pericardium, and it's a double serous membrane. Serous membrane is just a fluid-type membrane. So there's the visceral pericardium, which you'll see when we dissect the heart, is basically continuous with the heart. You almost can't even see that it's there. And then there's the parietal pericardium, which is the outside layer. And in between those two layers is fluid. And the heart is actually floating in that fluid. So if there's a problem such as increase in that serous fluid around the heart, that can cause pressure on the heart and cause a heart attack. You'll see that when we talk diseases at a later point. The heart itself has 3 layers, the epicardium on the outside, and then it's basically connective tissue on the outside portion of the heart. Then the myocardium is muscle. It's the middle layer. This is what you think of when you think heart. It's that reddish muscle. And then endocardium is the inner layer. It's actually endothelial cells. This is the part that touches the blood as it's moving through all the chambers. Here's the external heart anatomy, a great picture to know. Main structures that you should be familiar with include the superior vena cava, the right pulmonary artery, the aorta, the right pulmonary veins, the right atrium, the right ventricle, the inferior vena cava shown here. Then over here we have the apex of the heart, the left ventricle, the all-important giant pumper, the left atrium. You'll see when we dissect, you'll see the auricle, although you don't have to know that. Left pulmonary veins, left pulmonary artery, and those are the main ones that you need to know as far as that goes. Now, internally, the heart has left and right sides that work separately, kind of 2 pumps working in unison. There's 4 chambers. The atria on top, left and right. They receive blood from different regions. And then the ventricles are the pushing out ones. They're the bigger muscles, left and right. They push it to the lungs or to the rest of the body. So here's the internal anatomy. Another great picture to know. Once again, we have the superior vena cava and the pulmonary arteries there. Here's the pulmonary veins. Here's the right atrium. Here's the tricuspid valve. It's one of the 2 AV valves. Held on by the chordae tendineae. And here's the inferior vena cava. This is the right ventricle. The right ventricle, you'll notice here, is also the pulmonary semilunar valve, one of the 2 semilunar valves. Here's the pulmonary artery, the aorta, left atrium, pulmonary veins, left ventricle, and again, another AV valve. This one's the bicuspid because it only has 2 flaps, bi meaning 2. This is how the blood circulates. The right side pushes the blood through the pulmonary circuit. The left side pushes the blood through the systemic circuit. Red meaning oxygen-rich blood, blue meaning oxygen-poor blood. The pulmonary circuit, its function is to carry blood to the lungs for gas exchange and then return it back to the heart. And the pulmonary arteries are defined by the fact that they take blood away. It doesn't mean that they always have oxygen-rich blood. In this case, the pulmonary arteries are actually blue. They have oxygen-poor blood. And the pulmonary veins go to the heart. Ven means in Spanish to come back or to come. And so oxygen-rich blood comes to the heart from the lungs. The systemic circuit carries the oxygen and the nutrients through the blood to all the cells and then returns the oxygen-poor blood or CO2-rich blood back to the heart to move it to the lungs to exchange those things. Blood vessels, of course, are the arteries, which we talked to you about. The veins always carry oxygen-poor blood. Not always, but they always carry blood to the heart. And then we have the valves internally that I previously mentioned, the AV valves and the semilunar valves. They make sure that blood flow only goes one direction, and there's 4 of them. There's 2 AV valves, atrioventricular valves, and there's bicuspid and tricuspid. You can know them as atrioventricular valves or bicuspid and tricuspid. Bicuspid on the left, tricuspid on the right. You should come up with some clever little moniker to remember bicuspid left, tricuspid right. Then the semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the arteries, the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. There's the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. So the heart is, the valves are held in place by the chordae tendineae, as I mentioned, which stands for heartstrings, and they prevent backflow. So the blood only goes one direction, and it's more efficient in that way. And here you see how it works. Blood enters, in this case, through the superior vena cava into the right atrium. Then the right atrium pushes blood into the right ventricle through the AV valve. When the atria squeezes, the AV valve is open and blood fills into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle fills, it shuts this AV valve, and the right ventricle squeezes, pushes blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve here, as you can see. And then the backflow, the back pressure, builds up on the back of the semilunar valve here and causes that one to shut or close. And that's going to cause your dub sound, by the way. You'll learn that later. Okay. The aorta is the largest artery of the body. It leaves or connects to the left ventricle, takes blood out of the left ventricle, and we have the aortic semilunar valve found in the aorta. You then have the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries connect from the right ventricle and take blood to the lungs. Then the vena cava is plural, vena cava is one, enters the right ventricle, right atrium. We have superior on top and inferior on the bottom. And then the pulmonary veins go left and right, and they go to the left atrium, from the left side of the lungs and from the right side of the lungs. Coronary circulation is the teeny tiny blood vessels that feed the heart itself. It nourishes the myocardium, the actual muscle cells themselves. And it's basically its own circulatory system. And when somebody has a heart attack, you'll see we'll talk about blockage in one of these coronary arteries that feeds the heart itself. The blood is going to empty into the right atrium via what's called the coronary sinus. So not only is blood returning from the systemic circuit through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium, but you also have blood from the coronary circulation going into the right atrium through a little hole. Now, circulatory homeostatic imbalances. So there can be problems that result, of course, because things don't work properly. So there's something called angina, not vagina, angina. I know it sounds weird. Angina pectoris is angina of the pectoral region, and it's when the myocardium is deprived of oxygen. And the result of this is chest pain, okay? This is the initial instance of what's going to become a myocardial infarction. This is the beginning of it, angina pectoris, lack of oxygen to the myocardium. That lack of oxygen is going to cause ischemia, meaning heart cells are going to die as a result of that lack of oxygen, because there's basically a decrease in blood supply. Or I should say, ischemia causes angina pectoris, so lack of blood supply causes deprivation of oxygen, and that causes then a myocardial infarction, or for you, a coronary or heart attack. So again, important to note the order of these things. Ischemia, lack of blood supply, is going to cause angina pectoris, deprivation of oxygen, which is going to lead to a myocardial infarction. Good luck on the question. The heart itself has the ability to beat on its own. It doesn't need to be attached in the body. I remember very clearly when I was young, I went to see the first Indiana Jones. The guy towards the end of it shoves his hand into the man's chest and pulls out his heart. And I was young, and I freaked out and started crying and ran out of the theater because the heart was beating in the guy's hand, and I thought it was crazy and gross, and I can still see myself doing it. The heart beats by itself because it has its own intrinsic conduction system, and it uses specific nodes to maintain this baseline heart rate. Excuse me. You don't need the brain's involvement. What you need the brain's involvement for, and the medulla oblongata, is to alter the heart rhythm away or outside of normal, such as when you're exercising, and also to increase the strength at which the heart can contract, so the stroke volume, essentially. So at a baseline, the heart is going to beat at about 75 beats per minute, depending on your health. Lance Armstrong, for example, before we knew he was on steroids, this was a much better example. But I'll still use him. When he was at his peak athletic ability, his heart was so big that he only had to beat at rest 38 times per minute. which is very infrequent. You at rest, you're probably somewhere between 60 and 80 to push blood around. He only had to beat every basically 38 times per minute. So let's talk about this conduction system, the certain tissue. We have the pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, and this is the one that sits on the top of the heart in the right atrium, and it sends an electrical stimulus, a message, through the right atrium, and then meets at the AV node, or atrioventricular node. And then it passes, the atrioventricular node is between the atria and the ventricles, and then from the AV node it's going to go to the AV bundle, which is also more widely known as the bundle of His. Not bundle of His, it's not His, bundle of His, I know, weird. And then from the bundle of His it branches into left and right, we call those bundle branches. And then finally, one of the better words in anatomy phys, it spreads through the Purkinje fibers, which delve deep into the ventricular myocardium to spread the message all throughout all the cells of the heart. So this is why when the heart works, you have the top of the heart beating first, and then the bottom of the heart beats second. So boom, 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 boom. You can see here the sinoatrial node, or AV node, it spreads through the top of the heart. In fact, the right side of the heart is going to beat very briefly before the left atrium because of the location of the sinoatrial node. In people where this fails, by the way, they need to install a pacemaker because their sinoatrial node is not regulating their heart rhythm. They may have arrhythmia or something like that, atrial fibrillation, and as a result, they need to have an implanted microchip to take over for the sinoatrial node, and to basically connect that pacemaker to the AV node here. You see the AV node right at the junction between the atria and the ventricles. It passes through the bundle of His, which branches left and right into the bundle branches, and finally the Purkinje fibers spread into each of the ventricles there. So this together, along with the muscular contractions, makes up the cardiac cycle. So it takes a little bit less than a second for one cycle from beat to beat, basically, completing one heartbeat. And this includes atrial systole and diastole. Systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. So atrial systole is atrial contraction, atrial diastole is relaxation. So, and then we have ventricular systole and ventricular diastole. So first, the atria contract and relax, then the ventricles contract and relax, and then the cycle begins again. The atria are going to contract simultaneously, although as I mentioned, the right side slightly before, not noticeably, but slightly before the left. And then the atria will relax and the ventricles will contract. Most of the pumping, the strength is done by the ventricles. They're the biggest. So here let's show you, in general, we have mid to late diastole, which is when blood is flowing into the ventricles. This is how we describe it. Ventricular systole follows, which is when the blood pressure builds up. Just before the ventricles contract, the ventricles are filled. There's a pressure exerted on the walls of the ventricle, and they're ready to push out blood. That's the highest pressure in the heart, and you'll see we describe that or call that systolic pressure. We then have early diastole, where the atria are refilling and the ventricular pressure is low because the ventricles are in diastole, and the semilunar valves are shut. There's nothing going through the semilunar valves out of the ventricles. This is showing you all that and what's going on in a chart form. Another variation for you. You can jot that down if you want, just a different variation of what we just talked about and showed you. And then here's a diagram showing you the same thing. Ventricular filling occurs during mid to late diastole. So the atria are squeezing. Diastole, in this case, is referring to the ventricles, right? They're filling up. The atria are squeezing. The atria are in systole. And then it finishes as the ventricles finish filling up. Now the atria are relaxed and the ventricles squeeze. This begins ventricular systole. The atria are in diastole, of course. This is the contraction phase. And then we have the ejection phase, where the blood is actually moving through the semilunar valves into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. And this is the end of ventricular systole. And then finally we have early diastole, which is relaxation again of the ventricles. And the atria are filling. And you notice there may be a little bit of blood left behind in the ventricles at the base there. Not all of it can come out sometimes. When your heart squeezes, it makes a sound. We call it the lubbed up sound. It goes lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up. Sometimes I like to describe it like this. And what you're going to notice is that the first sound is louder. The second sound is quieter, of course. The first sound comes from the AV valves that are closing. These are the ones between the atria and the ventricles. And this signifies ventricular systole, the initiation of ventricular systole. So the ventricles are filled. blood is, the muscles are squeezing, and that blood pushes on the backside. So if this is an AV valve, blood from the atria opens these valves and fills the ventricles. And then as the blood fills, now the ventricles squeeze, and this blood is going to go through the pulmonary artery and the aorta. And as a result, when it squeezes, blood pushes up against the bottom side of these valves and slams them shut. And that slamming of the flaps of the valves, of the AV valves shut, makes a sound. Specifically, the first one is the loudest because it's from the ventricles squeezing, which happen to be the biggest muscles. So this slamming shut is the strongest. The second sound, the dup sound, comes from the semilunar valves in the pulmonary artery and the aorta. And this is when blood just causes them to close behind. This actually signifies ventricular diastole. There's no more blood left in the ventricles. All this, the whole job of the heart is basically to move blood, to push it out. Okay? And so its ability to push out, we actually measure through a term called cardiac output. This is the amount of blood pumped by each side of the heart in 1 minute. It's a measurement of the fitness of the heart. And cardiac output is defined by the heart rate times the stroke volume. Stroke volume is how much blood is pumped out by the ventricle in one contraction, and this can vary. A bigger heart would have a higher stroke volume and thus might need a slightly lower heart rate to maintain a certain cardiac output. If you have a smaller heart or a smaller stroke volume, you'll need a faster heart rate, which is why in part smaller animals and smaller people often have higher or faster heart rates than larger ones because they have a higher stroke volume. Now, all of this is regulated through a whole series of various things that dictate blood volume and so on. We won't go too in-depth into this, but you do know the effect of exercise increases the amount of blood pumping and its speed. So the stroke volume is going to increase, and as a result, the cardiac output is going to increase. You might need to manipulate heart rate. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems adjust or affect that heart rate, of course. You know, if you hemorrhage or lose blood, that's going to decrease venous return or venous return and affect your stroke volume. Then there's hormones like epinephrine that affect heart rate, and then stress and so on. So all these factors come in together to boost heart rate, shown in green, and to reduce heart rate, shown in red. And this is your normal day-to-day interactions in life. And on that note, we are done, and I'll see you for part 2. I'm out.